Good afternoon, everyone. Super excited to be on here this afternoon for a special edition of Ernestly Speaking with your host, Ernest Owens. It's been a while since I have done this show. And, given the times that we're currently in right now in Philadelphia and across the country, this was an opportunity for, myself to really get people together to talk about the importance of this election that's coming up. We are in the home stretch. We are literally days away. It feels like it was almost an eternity since we last got together in 2016, when at that time, the conversation was about Bernie and Hillary and, of course, Trump. So today, we have a special episode lined up. I've brought two of my most esteemed special guests to discuss some of the most important issues pressing this election and beyond. And with so much going on, I really want to have local perspective, people that are in Philadelphia doing some incredible things, but also people who come from different experiences and lived experiences that shape how they feel about what's at stake in this election. There's a lot on the table. There's a lot of conversations about, equity and access, diversity, inclusion, criminal justice issues around the economy, COVID-19. It's all on the table, and it's all on the ballot. And, with me, I have special guests. I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll get into the conversation because there's just so much to unpack. So we'll start off with Sharron Cooks, who is the CEO of Making Our Lives Easier, LLC. She is an award-winning strategist. She has been a part of the political scene in Philadelphia for a long time. She's done a lot of great consulting work with nonprofits and community advocacy organizations across various topics and issues, specifically pertaining to race and the community at large. Also, I have special guest Abdul-Aliy Muhammad. They are a community advocate, mobilizer, the co-founder of the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, which really had led the fight in the charge against racism and LGBTQ community, in addition to doing a lot of work in addressing healthcare disparities and disfranchisement and white supremacy that's been happening on the local level. And so they will also be a part of the conversation as well during this topic around the election and beyond. So before we get into the hot topics, let's just do a litmus test for people. How are you feeling right now as we get closer to Election Day 2020? I'm going to start with you first, Sharron.
The closer that we get to the election, I just feel that there is a lot of tension, and I feel that once Election Day happens and the votes are counted, there'll be a sense of relief for some people. It depends on which side you're on. But right now, I really think there is just so much tension politically, locally, nationally. I don't really know how this election is going to turn out. 4 years ago, I was a DNC delegate, and I was completely convinced that we, as the Democrats, were definitely going to win and Hillary was going to win. I bought into the hype of it all. And now we're 4 years later, and I kind of see a lot of the same patterns of the Democratic Party's strategy. And it really has me very concerned about Election Day and whether, Trump is going to get another term. There are several things that are, at stake. There's health care for various marginalized communities. The Affordable Care Act is on the table. That is going to affect people in the LGBT community. That's going to affect people with pre-existing conditions, people with ability issues. all across the spectrum. So I think there is a lot of anxiety. I think there is a lot of anticipation and excitement around the election that's coming up.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm here. Yes, it's to you, Abdul. How are you grappling with the election as we get to the days coming up?
I would have to agree with Sharron. I think, I was, I'm going to take it a bit further back than Sharron did. I remember when Bush was running for re-election, and there was this, I guess, excitement about the possibility that John Kerry would win. And we all know what happened during that election. And, Ohio, it came down to Ohio, and I was actually in Ohio at the time, really optimistic about electing someone new to office. And we saw what happened. And I was devastated, doing a lot of anti-war organizing at the time, seeing that again, with voter suppression, with a lot of election fraud, Bush was reelected, and we know that the second election came down to Ohio, where there was a lot of tactics used to confuse voters on what days to vote, and that cost the Democrats the election. And so this time, I'm I'm anxious, just like everyone else. I don't personally want a Trump re-election, and I know so many others don't want that. And like Sharron said, there's so much at stake, and so I'm anxious and also nervous about the outcome, because I think some folks are really excited and feel like it's a shoo-in for the Democrats, and so I just don't know. Like Sharron said, about 4 years ago, we might get to the end of that day, the end of that following week, and be shocked again. So I'm bracing myself for all the possibility of the outcomes right now.
Absolutely. I think when I saw the polls, everyone's saying that Biden has this double-digit margin, and we've had the same conversations in 2016 around Hillary, where everyone was saying, hey, we have these huge polls, the numbers are looking good, she's a shoe-in. I think every major pollster, with the exception of maybe one, pretty much said that Hillary was going to get it by a landslide. And let's be clear, they were correct that she did get the popular vote, but she did not get the Electoral College. And so elections are numbers games, essentially. I mean, the Electoral College, their votes, how they vote, actually decide the election, not the popular vote. And the interesting thing is that it's kind of decided upon states, and people don't understand the numbers, because in California, there was a large number of people that voted overwhelmingly for Hillary, that was more voters than Ohio. But if he wins Ohio, then the electoral votes go in his favor. Those numbers and those people don't swing over to Ohio or smaller states with smaller populations. And so, like, for example, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, came out and largely voted for Hillary, but she did not have enough votes across the Commonwealth to secure the win to win the state. And so in these situations, even if she might have been neck and neck with him, whoever wins the state wins all the delegates. They don't even do a partial cut. So that's something also that people are talking about, is that with the Electoral College, you don't get a partial cut. Either you get them all, if you get the majority, you win them all. And all of those count towards the win. And so it's not like that. Because I think if they piecemealed it, Hillary probably would have had an advantage in that regard too. But they don't piecemeal it. It's an all or nothing zero sums game with electoral votes. And Trump just hit her in certain tight areas like Michigan. Wisconsin was also another other states. And I feel like with Biden, I'm looking at what's happened in Pennsylvania. I'm looking at what's happened in Philadelphia. And, we're all Black on this this show. We're seeing some different things happening with Black voters, specifically this election cycle, that was boiling up with Hillary, but with Biden, it's just going to another level. And it's interesting because, identity politics are playing different parts in this. Hillary's ticket with Tim Kaine was a white ticket. There was no, people of color, no black person on the ticket. In this case, Kamala Harris is she's of mixed ancestry. She's black and Indian descent. She's a woman and she's running for VP. She isn't doing too well with certain pockets of the black community, in particular black men. And in fact, recent studies came from, I think, 534, this polling company that has got a lot of recognition, said that that Trump is actually faring well 4 years later with black male voters, noticeably, and with black voters. Now, let's be clear. His numbers are from 70, went from in the 70s to the 50s. So he's doing very bad, but he's doing less bad with 4 years in office in comparison to where he was in 2016 before he was in office. And people are trying to figure out what's going on there. I went to a barbershop in West Philadelphia, talked to some, just working class, everyday black men who were basically speaking about their experiences on the campaign. They feel like the Democratic Party is taking their vote for granted. They feel like they're not being seen. A lot of people are having voter apathy, concerns about local politics. It was a lot of things being discussed. And I wanted to ask, both of you all, what have been your observations on it? And I'm happy to have, a black woman on the panel and a black man. So I want to hear different experiences. So Sharron, as a black woman, the Democratic Party sees you as the backbone of electoral politics. You was a DNC delegate in 2016. You've had a lot of involvement in local politics, and also you've had conversations nationally. What is your observation about what's happening right now with the black vote in this election period? And I'm going to bring it to you afterwards, Abdul, to follow up.
I think it's really interesting because I've always had a stance that when it comes to politics, I don't think that I know that the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign, and there's been various different musical artists and rappers that have been Black that have come out to support or not support or to be political. My particular stance is if you're an artist in that regard, I think that one's political message should come through their art and not through policy. I think that the people who should be looked at for policies that are really going to impact the Black community are Black scholars and intellectuals. But I have seen and I've heard, it being very polarizing. We live in a patriarchal world, a very male-dominated world. And, Donald Trump not only represents male whiteness, but he also represents maleness, patriarchy, and, a sense of dominance in our community. So I think that from my view, I think that a lot of Black men are, starting to look at Donald Trump in a very different way, maybe as, a self-made person, or they're looking toward him as something to aspire to as far as being, economically, gaining a certain sense of economic wealth. So I think in that respect, as a Black woman, and I don't speak for all Black women, but as, a Black woman, there are just as a woman, period, there are a lot of very problematic things that have, come out of the White House. And, just to see certain Black men and rappers actually kind of support Donald Trump and some of his policies or support him in any way, shape, or form without actually looking at, how it's going to affect Black women. I think that's a blind spot that a lot of these Black men are seeing. They're not actually seeing like, yeah, this might benefit you as a man, but like, how is it going to benefit your counterpart, the Black woman? And I think that that is a spot that a lot of Black men who've been speaking out politically, most recently, Ice Cube didn't necessarily take a stance either way, but he spoke out about it. And then going back to your comment about Kamala Harris, Black women don't see ourselves, I, as a Black woman, I'll speak for myself, I, as a Black woman, don't see myself reflected in Kamala Harris or her experience. So it's like, I definitely, support, the men of my community. But I also want them to recognize that there are a lot of policies that are coming out of the White House that are not benefiting the Black woman and that are actually setting us back. And I think that they should, take a minute to examine them.
Absolutely. And so I'll bring that question to you, Abdul. What do you think are some of the observations you've noticed, particularly with this election, these campaigns, and the Black vote in 2020?
I would agree with Sharron. I think, seeing the alignment of Black men with patriarchy, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. It's unfortunate to see that. Like Sharron said, you would hope that folks would invest in their art and not, make comment or try to lead conversations where, they haven't been a part of those conversations in a critical way. It's unfortunate to see that, but it doesn't surprise me at all. I think, it's a difficult moment that we often find ourselves in as Black people, right? We're oftentimes told to vote as harm reduction, and it makes sense in this election, right? There are very clear points, a policy that's different between Trump and Biden, but there's also this problematic way that Democrats embrace this idea of liberalism or reform. I mean, we saw that during the Biden town hall where he said, his response to police-involved shootings or police terror was basically shoot him in the leg, right? And we this idea that the system doesn't intend to kill Black people, that police doesn't intend to kill Black people. And there's a false analysis. And I think Black people are divesting from the electoral process because there's no clear policy direction that either party is going in that embraces Black liberation. And so I think that that's always going to be a struggle, and it's a struggle during this election, especially in a battleground city like Philadelphia, where you just had the shooting of Walter Wallace, and again, to Sharon's point, like the Democratic Party, and Ernest and Sharron, you both know my experience with local Democrats.
My experience with the local Democrats.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan.
Yeah, so
I always had issues with local Democrats.
Right. I struggle with this constant refrain of vote, right? Vote, get out the vote and vote. When, like Sharron said, that you clearly divested from certain pockets of the community. You don't really care unless you want us to show up to the polls. And what happens after the election? What will happen? What will be done policy-wise, right, to actually upend or shift our experience? And I think that is what is bubbling to the surface even more with the possibility of another 4 years with a white supremacist, an overt white supremacist.
I think it speaks more to the point, to the Black community, like what I would, pose is, if these Black men who are celebrities are having these meetings, I think, there should be some community input. Like my stance is like Black community, we know that our vote is powerful. So let us get together and let us as a community decide what we're going to do, whether we have to start our own party, because no one else is going to have our interests. And the world is being seen through the eyes of white people. It's not being told through our stories or our experiences. And I think that that is very important in molding and shaping policy. We can't trust a system that has shown itself to be biased and unjust. And the most recent incident that you just mentioned, Abdul, with Walter Wallace Jr., we cannot expect this system to change. This system has been in place, and the ideology and the actions are being perpetrated. We are moving into a different era where there has been a Supreme Court, another Supreme Court installation. So I believe that's 6 conservatives that are on there now. But, more, to the point, we as Black voters, we as Black people, we have to figure out what we're going to do amongst ourselves so that then we have something to negotiate with. We don't have anything to negotiate with right now but our vote. And I'm tired of the Democrats putting on performative rhetoric. And I think that that is really what's giving the Republicans a little bit of steam, is that, no one picks up, no Republicans generally pick up the phone and call a Black person or a Black celebrity and say, hey, what are your thoughts? Just the mere fact that that attention is being given says something. Now, what it says, we can, philosophically discuss, but it actually says something, versus Democrats always just this expectation of, oh, we know that we're going to get the Black vote. And I think that if we're going to have any type of power or say so in the policies, that we actually have to galvanize ourselves and stop thinking that white politics or this particular system that is in place is going to save us.
Absolutely. I think that one of the biggest things that we're looking at collectively is that the Black vote is important, and a lot of in Philadelphia, for example, this is a very diverse city. It's a majority Black and brown. If Black and brown people don't show up to the polls, we will see impact. I mean, for example, in 2016, when we had the general election, Hillary had less voters. A voter turnout in Philadelphia, which they said impacted how Pennsylvania turned red in 2016, because Pennsylvania was blue for Obama in 2012, 2008. And then all of a sudden in 2016, it went red. And that was largely because of the voter turnout in Philadelphia. The majority of Philadelphians voted for Hillary. However, they did not vote for her in large numbers, which then gave Trump an advantage as he got an uptick in rural areas in the suburbs, which then created that disproportion in the votes statewide. And what people have to remember is that Philadelphia is a pendulum. Yes, Philadelphia has the ability to tip the scale in Pennsylvania, but Philadelphia also, if there's not a high voter turnout in Philadelphia, then that sets the stage for other people to take advantage in the state. And so right now, there's a lot of conversations. For example, there's a conversation right now about rural suburban women, how they're going to show up to the polls. Trump at rallies had said very publicly, pretty much begging and saying to suburban women, like, vote for him. And he's running narratives, actually, which is very, of course, problematic, but he's have said a lot of problematic things throughout the tenure of his presidency. But one of the points that he's been saying to suburban women specifically is that he's kept their neighborhoods safe. He's kept he's helped push out crime in their areas, from urban crime and these narratives around protecting their neighborhoods, which is to suggest a racist trope that these suburbs are being predominantly white, and that in many ways the crime is coming from people who do not look like them. But we know that there's been a lot of integration over the past decade and even before then of suburbs where they are not actually just white areas of land. I mean, more so it's a wealth difference more than a racial difference in some aspects, especially in Montgomery County, Delaware County, Bucks County. There's a couple of other neighboring suburbs that are diverse and are not necessarily just filled, and even a lot of interracial relationships as well. So when he talks about this suburban mom, and he's planning it like it's a white woman that lives in some neighborhood in some town, and that he's protected them from pretty much suggesting urban life, which is again overt, subtle, actually overt racist language. These types of things is spiking what's going to make the difference. My question to you all, starting with you, Abdul, is what do you think is going to make the difference in getting the voter turnout in Philadelphia if there's still hope? I mean, do you think there's still hope? Do you think it's going to be lower than Hillary? If you think it's going to be higher, I mean, if so, what do you think is going to be the difference between, if you think it's going to be lower, why? If you think it's going to be higher, why? I guess I'll put that to you first, and then Sharron, you can follow up.
It might be higher. Who knows? I don't know. I think it could go either way in terms of voter turnout. I have seen personally, I did try to go to an early voting center, and there was a line, and I had to, try other places, and I still haven't been able to vote that way. So I don't know. I don't know if that is an indication that folks are turning out more because of just the material conditions of Black folks over the past 4 years in Philly and nationally. I personally don't think that there is enough that the Democrats can do now. It's too late. The work that should have been done, like Sharron said, the work, those conversations, the connection to folks who feel like they don't want to invest in electoral politics, that kind of work should have been done over the past 4 years. And honestly, it wasn't done, right? Folks were really focused on their re-elections locally. And honestly, the Democratic Party also benefits from low voter turnout in Philadelphia. To be honest, right? That is something that they kind of want to see also. I mean, it's obvious from the disengagement of certain communities, right? We know in Philly that most Democrats are trying to go for, liberal white people or older Black folks in the city, right? They don't really try to go for young voters, right? Until really they need they need the influx of young voters to make a difference in an outcome. At least that's from my experience, what I've noticed with the Democrats in Philly. So I don't know. I don't know if there is, maybe it's my pessimism, but I don't see that there is anything that they can do in this final hour of the election to shift voter turnout.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think that people who vote are going to vote. I don't think there's going to be like any new voters. The people who generally participate and civically engage, I think those are going to be the people who are going to go out, who have gone out and either voted early or are going to go out on election day and vote. I agree with Abdul that one of the things that you said earlier, also Ernest, is that they really need, if they're going to tell people to get out to vote. I don't think that's a solid enough message for me personally, just in my opinion. We need to have workshops around civic engagement. We need to have a workshop series around political literacy. People need to know what they're voting for, how important it is, if they are going to participate in the process, and that's going to take a lot of work. And it's really the young people that are leading the revolution right now. You know, the early 20 somethings, the people who are just coming out of coming out of high school, going into college, or people that are just, in college or coming out of college right now, people who are like in the entry levels of their, starting career. All of those people right now are really going to be the agents of change that we're going to see in the future. I think people who are a little bit more settled are just going to bite the bullet and say, you know what, Biden Harris, we've got to get, Trump out of there. It's kind of sort of goes back to 4 years ago for me, the lesser of two evils. So I'm like, here we are again, 4 years later, and we have the lesser of two evils. So I think that, people are just going to be like, all right, Biden, Harris, and, blindly, turn away as they pull the lever or fill out their form. But I don't think that we're going to have a surge in new voter turnout. I think that what is locally and nationally, the young folks and the young people that need to be inspired are not inspired in that to be a part of the political process in that way. A lot of them are very down with the establishment. None of this works, and we're just fed up and we're over it. We can see a lot of that being displayed currently right now here in Philadelphia. So yes, to sum up the question, I think the people who vote are always going to vote. I don't think there will be any new voter turnout, but moving forward, I think that, a lot of the old guard here in Philadelphia really do need to pay attention to the young people. We're always talking about young people, the youth this, the youth that. Well, you know what? It's time for us to actually start making pathways for the youth to actually start standing up, because a lot of these people have been in office with the same old ideas and nothing has changed. They need to let some new blood come in.
I agree. And I definitely think this is an interesting aspect of it with the voter turnout. I mean, for myself, I have covered local politics for a long period of time in Philadelphia, and there is an uprising happening politically in the local level. We're seeing, echoes of it nationally with the squad, but we're not seeing it at the same speed compared to how it's going in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we have seen we have seen a third party candidate get city council at large, which has unseated a Republican, which is a big deal. We have seen a 27-year, over 25-year incumbent who had a city council seat be unseated by a first time candidate. James Roebuck was a longtime state rep who got unseated by a first time political candidate who has very socialist ideals in his campaign. His name is Rick. And then you have a state senator Larry Farnese, who was well regarded within the Democratic Party and establishment, who lost his seat to a first timer, who also has socialist politics and I guess socialist democratic views. This is a big deal. This all happened within a year. And there's many more stories or experiences where we're starting to see this uptick in this political change. And your point about, what voters seem to want. But I also want to be clear, and I want to talk about, some of the issues on the stake, but I also want to talk about, on the ballot, there are several other issues being addressed. It's not just the presidential candidates. And, sadly, a lot of the issues that are even happening right now with the death that took place just recently, the police shooting that took place. And there's conversations about ballot questions. For example, there's a ballot question about supporting victims, victim services. There's a conversation about, more police oversight. There's also, ballot conversations about the budget. Like, should the city, basically, take out more loans in order to pay for, recreational aspects and things for the city. So there's other aspects on the ballot, and there's also a lot of seats, congressional seats and of the like that's happening statewide. So part of me, thinks, is it the lack of competitive races in the general election in Philadelphia that might be making others feel like the presidential race is only the ballot. Abdul, you made a really good point about how they have been in many ways suppressing the vote every 4 years. And that was a really strong point because it is true. I gotta keep it 100, right? That's what we're doing, earnestly speaking. We don't see competitive races often in Philadelphia on the local level. When we do, it's a big darn deal. And when it happens, everyone's really engaged. Like everyone's really talking about it. And we do see upsets. But what we don't often talk about is that during the primary process, when we see challengers get knocked off the ballot. There's all the politics with the legalities of it all. It's the petitions, it's the signatures, it's Adam Bonin. It's all of the familiar faces that work towards getting people off the ballot. And when you have seen that every cycle, because let's be clear, elections, everyone, happen every 6 months. You have an election in the spring, you have an election in the fall. They happen every 6 months. But for some reason, we only talk about them on a large scale every 2 years because that is the midterm elections, and then every 4 years, which is the general election. But there's an election every cycle. Like in the spring, we will be having conversations about electing or re-electing the DA. We'll be having a conversation about the city controller. Like these are seats that starts at the primaries. And honestly, I feel like every year there's an exciting election to be had, in my opinion. I don't know a dry year because next year after that we'll be having the midterms. We'll be having the midterms in 2022. And then in 2023, I think we'll be getting geared up again for the mayoral elections, I think. And then in 2024, we'll be back at it again with the presidential election. Every year is an exciting year. I mean, next year, next year's big conversations, the DA's races. I think the governor's races are coming soon.
Yes.
So I mean, that's hot, but that's happening every 6 months with primaries. So if you don't participate in the primaries, then the general in Philadelphia just kind of feels like a blah. And so I'm trying to figure out, and I guess my next question to you all is, what do you think is going to take to change the conversation from voting, and not even just voting, but just what is it going to take, you think, for people in the Philadelphian voters to be engaged with the electoral process, not just only every 4 years, but how do we change? What recommendations or things do you feel like can change the conversation for people to be like, you know what, I'm voting in May and I'm voting in November, to keep this consistency with voting and not just voting alone? Because let me just say this before I say this, because I know a lot of you probably both feel this way. I can't stand how elected officials specifically always act like voting is the only aspect to democratic exchange. As someone who is a writer, as someone who has, organized, have been at protests and demonstrations, have participated in public hearings, there are 1,000 different ways to carve the turkey. And I'm not going to say voting is not important, because it is absolutely important. And I encourage people to practice their right to vote because it matters. But I often get annoyed when elected officials tell people that vote, and that's it, right? They don't want you to do nothing else. They don't want you to go to the community hearings. They don't want you to protest. They don't want you to create a petition to get things taken care of. But they only tell you to just vote. And oftentimes they only tell you to vote because they know that you're in their district and they don't have a challenger. And so they just want you to put their people on. So Abdul, as someone has, you have worked on political campaigns, you have done community organizing, you have been on nonprofit boards, you've been in all the processes of this. And, I don't want to ask you what you think is the most important aspect of democratic expression, but what do you tell people to tell them about participating in voting, and how do you what is the case you make to people who are like, feeling like they're voter apathetic? How do you change that narrative from what elected officials are telling people every day about just vote? what is your notions on the just vote case that's being made?
I mean, that's the extent of the politicians' political analysis. No shade, but that, you know, it's either go vote or here's a turkey or I'm North Philly's biggest fan or whatever. You know, these taglines. But there's no actual substance there. There's no actual, like, what are you doing policy wise that's going to change the material conditions of folks in North Philadelphia? I mean, are you challenging councilmanic prerogative? Are you challenging like these large development projects that are displacing people? What are you doing about housing? What are you doing to shift the conversation into actual policy? And I think that is the struggle that we see, right? Politicians kind of go into office because they have class aspirations. That's the truth, right? They want to make a certain amount of money. They have these, they are self-centered and egoist a lot of times. And it's not really about the people, right? They talk the rhetoric because that's what they need to say to get elected. And so I think we need actual folks who aren't a part of the misleadership of Philadelphia and actually want to put some work in to actually shift policy in office instead of folks who are like trying to grandstand and be, you know, the first or whatever it is, you know, in office. And I think that's what I see that's an issue, is what Sharron said earlier. Folks don't try to engage the voters about why you should be voting for a certain ballot question, right? Why should you vote for me? It's kind of like, it's about identity. I'm Black, I'm from this part of the city, and you need to vote for me. And we know that, you know, Black leadership in Philadelphia doesn't mean that folks are for Black folks. So it's more than just identity. It's actual your analysis of the political situation. But outside of that, I think organizing and keeping pressure on politicians, because politicians won't do the work themselves. I'm going to tell you, you have to keep fire to their feet in order to see shifts happen in policy. And that's what I'm just going to speak from my experience with all the work that we've done in organizing spaces. Like, that is what happens when you start to continue to put pressure and direct action as a part of the conversation. Politicians have no way of ignoring that, right? And so I think that it's kind of both, right? I don't know. Sharron?
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you loud and clear. Sharron, what do you think?
What was the question again?
What is your response to elected officials who are heavily on the just vote tip and the rhetoric around just voting? Because I think people should vote, right? Because, you know, that's a way to participate in a political process. But oftentimes it's only a conversation about voting and nothing else. And so some people feel like all they have to do is show up to the polls and vote, and then they can sit down for, like, you know, 6 months and just chill. As someone, again, you've worked on political campaigns, you've even ran as a delegate, you know, you got a delegate seat. You've participated in elections, organizing, you know, in the same vein. What is your thoughts when you hear this conversation being told to voters and to Philadelphians?
It goes back to my earlier comment. You know, to me, for a politician or anyone who's involved in political campaign to urge someone to vote without any type of context is benign neglect. So I think, in a sense, you know, these people who are running for elected office are really betting on the ignorance of these other people and neglecting to properly educate them on what their platform may be or what the political platform may be. So I think that a lot of the electoral politics are very predatory in the sense of, oh, get out and vote, but what am I voting for? Why am I voting for this? Like, there needs to be a lot of engagement around political literacy and an understanding of policy. I think when we talk about policy and education, those two things need to be merged together. Like you can't just you can all of a sudden just wake up and decide to be involved in the political process, whether it's being an activist, a community organizer, being a journalist, getting out, like in the various types of ways. However, I think that at the end of the day, a lot of these people are just very self-driven. They want to have positions that give them some leverage, and that's okay, but what are you using that position and that leverage for? Are you using it to continue to exploit your people, or are you using it in the best interest of the people who actually got you elected? And by just saying, go out and vote or go vote without any type of context, I think is very neglectful. And I think that a lot of politicians need to start taking responsibility that they are actually praying or hoping that people are not educated in politics or the political procedure or what their platform is or what another political party's platform is. We have the Green Party, we have independents. Like you mentioned, there were independent candidates who ran, in our city council cycle, and one actually got a seat. There are Green Party candidates who are in smaller local elections here in Philadelphia, but a lot of people don't know about that. So I think when you have this message to get out and vote, that's really good. Exercise it, but it needs to be in context, current context, contemporary context, as well as historical context, especially in the Black community, because the first thing someone says, if he says, oh, I'm not going to vote, oh, a lot of people died, and they go into this rhetoric, but it sounds more like rhetoric and talking points as opposed to actually let's sit down and have a conversation and dive into the history of why the vote matters and why it's important for you to matter. And I would also like to say that, as Black people, our vote don't matter anyway, but go ahead.
So I will say into some of this and making sure I talk about some of these points that are brought up. I definitely think that when I hear people use the rhetoric around ancestors wanting us to vote, I do think that people, I always have a problem with people giving a historical narrative around what that means. I think that, to be clear, our ancestors fought for our liberty to live and exist and have a choice. And I think that the importance is that everyone in this country has a choice. You have a choice to choose. To choose not to vote is a choice. It's a vote within itself. I mean, even if you go to the ballot, there's an option for you to say you could cast a no vote. I have friends and people I know who have specifically casted a no vote in certain elections. Mind you, they weren't as contested as the presidential election, but they were like, I'm going to go to the polls. My elected official was currently indicted. Not my current one, but this was where they were at that moment. My current elected official is indicted, and this person is pretty much uncontested. I'm not going to vote for the Republican, but I don't want to vote for the Democrat, and I'm going to vote for other people, but I'm going to specifically cast a non-vote for this person because I want people to know that I have a vote of non-confidence. We have to remind everyone, especially Black voters and voters of color in general, that we are entitled to have decisions and make decisions about how we stand in politics. And it does not have to always be that we bash people upside the head about what they're obligated to do. And I hate sometimes that in many cases with both of these political campaigns, that Black people are often used as the obligatory vote rather than treated as a full human being that has nuanced experiences. And to be quite honest, I think it's perfectly human and normal for Black people, specifically in this country, to wrestle with, one, voting, but two, both of these political parties, because the history is there. And I think that as a community and as people who are mobilizing, like you said, Sharron, I agree with you. There should be a conversation with people about voting. I think Black people never get an opportunity to just talk about the mere decision making and processes of actually voting. It's kind of those things that we just get up and just do, right? We learn to talk at a young age. We learn about body language, about how to walk in the street, how to engage with law enforcement. These things have been subtly put into our psyche culturally, and we've never questioned any of it. And one of those things was just vote blue, vote this, vote this. And we've never actually been able to be given the freedom to really say, okay, well, why do I have to vote? It's almost like it's blasphemous if Black people are questioning the political systems that be, the very systems that have had a history for over 400 years of not being kind to us and actually being quite oppressive. And so I think that it's fair that people, especially Black voters in this country, have the agency in a free, safe space to question the process, to question both parties, to have nuance, to be able to wrestle with all of these different things, because there's so much, there's so much there. So in wrapping this up, also I want to add this point, this caveat, that I do think that while on a national scale, the Black vote can be somewhat not necessarily going to move or shake on a demographic level, I do think that there is those pendulums in primaries that happens. One would argue that if Bernie Sanders won South Carolina, Biden would not be the nominee. The Black vote is valuable to the Democratic Party in primaries, especially with establishment politicians, because the Black vote drove the primaries for him. General election, again, if you're looking on a wider scale, one would argue not so much. But when you look at these cities like Philadelphia, if Black people don't show up to the polls in Philadelphia, and if they say, we're not feeling Kamala, we're not feeling Biden, we don't care about any of this, they will make their voices loud and clear with how Pennsylvania plays out. And that's not the obligation of them, and it shouldn't be the obligation of them. And I want to be very clear on that point, because I think, again, it's the responsibility of these campaigns to speak to the people that they say matter. If you say Black voters matter, then make them matter. Make them matter in your campaigns. Make them matter in your policy. Make them matter in the way that you are recruiting and including them in your rallies. You all know that I've been covering the Biden campaign extensively in Philadelphia, and one of the things that have been annoying me has been the use of surrogates and the use of rallies that do not include community-centered. I went and heard Obama speak at a recreation center in North Philly at the Hank Gathers Recreation Center. And while I was there, it was 20 Black men who were, there was supposed to be a Black male voter engagement conversation, but most of the people in the conversation were elected officials, ward leaders, committee people, and surrogates that had already been overused throughout the entire campaign. So I was thinking to myself, where are the everyday voters? Where are the undecided voters? Where are the young Black first-time voters that you are trying to engage in this election process? And I do agree with the points that was made too by you, Abdul, and you, Sharron. It's like there's this constant social mobility climb, this financial level, right? Because some of these people are getting health care for the first time in office. Some of these people are finally getting decent living because they live in districts where no one's getting affordable housing and accessible. But when they run for office, they are finally able to get an income that can afford them the very resources that many of their constituents are deprived of. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to not see this. But in wrapping up, I have one final question. We only got a few more minutes left. This has been a very great conversation. You know, people are going to be tweeting and talking about it all up until election day. But if you had one piece of advice to the political candidates after the election, whoever wins, we don't know. If you had one piece of advice, well, actually, take that back. Who cares about the politicians? What is the one piece of advice you have for voters after this election, regardless of the outcome? So if Trump wins or Biden wins, what are you going to tell voters that you want them to know that they need to do next? Because some people feel like, well, guess I got to vote another 4 years or another 2 years. What is the piece of advice you're going to tell them regardless of the outcome? So if Biden wins and they're happy and they're like, woo, woo, Biden won. Or if Trump wins and some people are like, woo, woo, Trump won, or they're like, yikes. What is your piece of advice that you have? I'm going to start with you, Sharron. I'm going to close out with you, Abdul, and then we're going to wrap up.
I can only tell people the model and the guide that I go by is that right now, this particular time that we're in, self-preservation is number one. If you're not taking care of yourself, you can't be of assistance or help to anybody else. And you can do that ethically and you can do that morally. Don't let the outcome of this election either or sway what your personal political views are or your personal ethics and morality. Stand in who you are. Know we're going to be resilient. I've lived through several Republican presidents when it wasn't such, the wonderful years of Obama to some people. So, we'll get through this. We're very resilient, especially Black people. But whether or not Trump or Biden wins, my message is really for the Black community. We have to stop relying on this white system and these white people to do anything for our community. Regardless of who gets in office, we need to galvanize ourselves. We need to have a Black social theory and an African worldview and decide what we as a community can do and what is best for us. That's what I have to say.
Awesome. And to you, Abdul, quickly.
Yeah. I want to say quickly to your earlier point, the Black people are in an abusive relationship with the electoral process. And, it's kind of, we damned if we do, we damned if we don't. And that's the honest truth of it all. And I agree with Sharron. I always think about self-preservation or taking care of oneself as the most important part of organizing work. Obviously, we have to have collective action always. That's how Black people thrive and survive, through collective action. And that's not going to change if it's a Biden-Harris presidency. And it's definitely going to be more needed and urgent if it's a Trump re-election. So take care of each other and yourselves and organize when you can and are able to, and in the ways that you make sense for you to do that.
Absolutely. So thank you all so much, my esteemed panelists and guests. Thank you all for watching this special election edition of Ernestly Speaking. I'm super excited to have be able to come back and to see you all and talk to you all. This election is a pretty big deal. There's a lot of decisions on the table. As you can see, there's a lot on stake. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of a lot of racial civil unrest in this country and across Philadelphia. And now more than ever, it's important for all of us to, understand the importance of voting, but also understand what's next, right? I like to tell people vote and then, rather than just simply vote. And there's a lot of people whose lives are going to be impacted by this. Our city's going to be impacted by it. And so all I have left to say to you is do the right thing and let's see each other on the side. Take care.